and gentlemen, let's get straight into this conversation. And I think a very critical one for many of you here in the room today, as has been highlighted by Busi, a number of entrepreneurs who are looking to start businesses. But how do we go from having that fantastic idea that you believe will somehow change the globe, drive a profit for you, and of course, allow other individuals to empower and emancipate themselves through the opportunities that you look to open up? Well, the first trick is to actually know where you are. So for many of us based in Johannesburg, in Lusaka, in Accra, or even in Lagos, you take a look at the environment around you and actually need to understand what needs do you need to address in this particular market and what opportunities actually exist there. Danesh, I'd like to start off with you. You, as a representative of Franklin Templeton, taking a look at extensive data with regard to macroeconomic conditions as well as political references. We won't get into the heaviness of that news right now because we are younger and we are funkier than that. But where on the African continent have you really seen spurts of growth, markets which are actually ripe for investment and that cultivate this culture for entrepreneurs to thrive?
Where we are seeing opportunities, we're seeing interesting opportunities in East Africa.
Sure.
And that's really a function of sort of those economies that are a little bit more diversified, perhaps less dependent on one single commodity, where in parts of West Africa, like Nigeria, there's a bigger dependency on oil. And when the oil price does become very weak, you tend to see those economies tend to weaken. And that has a sort of knock-on effect on sort of established and startup businesses. So that's from a macro perspective. We try and sort of understand how an economy is trying to think about managing sort of currency risk, managing sort of inflation. I won't get into the details of it, but we do tend to find that in East Africa they tend to have a more sort of stable currency sort of experience, even though it has depreciated, but it hasn't been as severe as in parts of Southern Africa or West Africa. Mm-hmm. And if you're an economy or if you're in an economy where you are importing goods, currency plays a big part. And also you get imported inflation, so even though you may be producing goods locally, you could have an imported component into your product or service that you actually... So those are the things that we look at. East Africa has been a better experience for us when we've looked across those markets.
Sure.
If I just touch on the regulatory sort of aspects as well, I think there's been a little bit more of a benign environment in East Africa, and if you think about places like Kenya, whereas Nigeria has sort of maybe a sort of slightly poorer reputation when it comes to regulation. And it's not so much about the regulation, it's about the amount and the clarity on regulation that we're really sort of focusing, because as regulation is important and is needed in many places all over.
I want us to delve into that and really talk about the companies that have certainly stood out, especially when it comes to East Africa, because it's quite a broad market, and we're talking Rwanda, Uganda, and most probably Kenya also stands out as one of those markets. But give us companies and tell us what they're doing that's really seeing them thrive.
Sure. So maybe Kenya, Safaricom, or the mobile money sort of business of theirs called M-Pesa, is a clear example of where regulation has worked well in its favor. This goes back to almost 10 years ago. I think the big issue in many African places was why mobile money didn't take off was because the regulator didn't allow the telcos to have a sort of pseudo-banking license. In Kenya, that wasn't the issue, and so you saw Safaricom launch their mobile money business with very little to almost negligible regulatory impact, and you saw that business essentially dominate with a nearly 80% market share now. And that's become really the model for other mobile businesses. And then if you look at Rwanda as well, if I just touch on it, I mean, it's sort of very authoritative, but the government there has been very benevolent, has allowed sort of businesses to privatize, and that's created a very sort of business-friendly sort of environment for.
It's interesting that you mention that, because I think for us as South Africans, when we think about this concept of mobile money, we naturally look at the local banks that we have, the likes of e-wallet. But I think we're so well banked, we're still competing about what color our cards are versus how flexible we are actually in being able to send money to each other using our mobile devices. But I want us to speak to two entrepreneurs who join us on the panel who are in very different sectors, very specialized sectors as well, but sectors that have certainly seen a lot of growth. And Linda, I'd like to start off with you. DLO, you play in the space of keeping the lights on, literally. I wish you could be our ESCOM, because essentially the energy would probably be more sustained in South Africa. Give us a brief understanding of your organization, and most importantly, where you've been able to find growth and where you had to start before launching DLO Energy.
Thanks, Gugu. I'll try and be as hip and cool as everyone else.
Make solar energy cool, make wind power cool.
But basically, DLO is a 100% black female-owned energy company. We own one of Africa's...
I think that needs recognition.
We currently own one of Africa's largest operational wind farm, which is 244 megawatts.
What does that mean?
That means we power over, just over 1,000 households in South Africa. We supply power to Eskom. We've also got projects we're developing in Botswana and Nigeria. And the goal is to be #1 in Africa, and we're well on track to do that.
And that's an amazing feat, because many of us might think, sure, if Eskom can't do this thing of keeping our lights on, I'd certainly like to jump on that bandwagon. But there were basic concepts that you needed to understand before even starting off your entity and delving into the world of energy. Because before you think of energy, you need to be an engineer, and you're not one.
No,
you're
I'm
actually
not.
a lawyer by profession.
I am, and I'm grateful I followed a different path in my law degree, which just shows you what you study doesn't necessarily dictate where you're going to end up, and who you learn from isn't necessarily going to be a certain type of person. So what I did is I studied law at UCT, got a scholarship to Scotland, and I started working in renewable energy there whilst I was doing my master's. Saw a gap in the market. In 2008, we're having the rolling blackouts, and I said, why can't we do renewables in South Africa, as I'm working for a renewable energy company here, and then started doing the investigation into what the laws said and the opportunities. I knew I wasn't an engineer. What I did is I approached engineers and said, this is what I'm good at. I'm good at the legal, and I'm good at putting commercial deals together. You guys be good at what you're good at, but give me the opportunity to buy equity into your company and grow my company from there. So you don't necessarily have to have the entire toolkit to start a business. You just need to have a core strength and identify a gap in the market. That, to me, is what an entrepreneur is.
And research, because you don't know what you're dealing with until you actually understand the system.
Yes, and you can't bypass research. So whatever great business, I say this carefully, but I stand to be corrected, but I don't think there's any new ideas out there in the world that someone else hasn't thought about. Your job as an entrepreneur is to find out what is your competitive advantage. Don't enter into a business if you do not have a competitive advantage, meaning what is going to set your company apart to be successful. Because remember, we're in business to make money. It's not charity. There's social entrepreneurship, but I'm saying if you're in a profit-making business, you need to know how are you going to make that profit.
Exactly. Benji, I'd like to come to you. You run and co-founder an amazing entity, drones everywhere, but this time making a real impact, not spying on what your neighbors are actually doing, but used within the agricultural environment to actually draw data as to how the crops are actually growing. So perhaps the grapes into the MCC that's being produced for the House of B&G, analyzing exactly how those particular crops are performing. That's a fantastic feat in a very tricky environment to be in, because you were actually first to market in this space. Where was the starting point before you started Aromatics?
Sure. So we started in about 2014. Myself and James, my co-founder, were both sitting overseas. I was in London, he was at MIT in Boston, and we were really looking at opportunities to kind of make a difference and make an impact. And I think as engineers, we both sort of worked in industry for a few years. We were in academia, and we felt like the only way we were really going to be capable of making a difference was through starting something ourselves. And at the same time, sort of after having this experience overseas, we thought back to South Africa, and we thought there's an opportunity to build sort of world-leading technology locally, given the talent pool that exists and the cost of talent comparatively. And what happened was we sort of, I think, had quite a unique way of looking at things, in that we were looking to innovate and really make a difference, rather than initially coming from a specific market or industry opportunity. And we sort of looked at our skill sets being in the aeronautical engineering space and the data space, and trying to find where we could position that best. We came across agriculture. And the findings that we had was, like, agriculture is a massive industry. The way farms are run at the moment is extremely sort of subjective. Decisions aren't made in a data-driven basis, and it's often just because the data doesn't exist. And there was this amazing problem from an engineering standpoint that we wanted to come tackle, being, can we help collect this data at scale using cutting-edge aerial technology, and sort of build the tools around that to help analyze and interpret that data. And I think, sort of being naive young engineers, we came back, thought we'd do everything. We were building drones, we were building cameras, we were writing software.
You guys are really smart. So this whole binary and coding element is essentially what you do, building up that software, which is a new element in the environment for many South Africans to learn and to adapt to in the particular field that you're in. But where did you have to start? Because as Linda has also mentioned, that research is quite imperative in order to make sure what your competitive advantage is. But you didn't have many competitors in the local environment.
Yeah, so I think it was very much us kind of making it up as we went. And there's concepts of minimum viable products. There was a lot of interviewing customers, trying to understand what the specific needs are. And it was very much up to us to kind of invent how this technology would look and how it would work. And I mean, as I mentioned, the space just didn't exist. So we had to build our own drones. We had to build our own cameras and sort of offer the full value chain. And I think over time, it's been more a question of learning like where the specific value proposition is and what are the actual needs that we're looking to solve. And I think pulling away from the technology and the way that we're solving these problems, digging into the actual value proposition has helped us sort of move more to, at the moment, entirely a software solution, helping with specific value propositions.
A quick one to the both of you before we take a look at that competitive edge as well as the data and finding data that you can drive. I want to get your views on sorting out the paperwork, because sometimes we get excited by registering your company on CIPC, which is the official registration affiliation in South Africa, essentially for companies. You open up the bank account and then some other paperwork just schemes through the background. How critical is that to make sure that as a basis when starting a business, you get that in order? Linda? Benji?
My sector is, like I said, it's a high market to entry. It's very critical. There's a lot of paperwork involved. Actually, for one bidding process in a renewable energy tender, it's this entire room filled with documents.
No way.
No, dead serious. When I say a lot of paperwork, so the market to entry is high.
Sure.
And we need to also question ourselves as South Africa if that the market entry to business, let's start it and maybe contextualize it in a sector outside of mine. Even registration with CICP, I find it cumbersome. So in the UK, when we registered, for example, you can go online, you have your company within 24 hours. In South Africa, it's not the same. You have your accountant, your tax people, all of that done in the UK within one day. Whereas the registration process in South Africa is quite costly, number one, quite cumbersome, and it's something that government really needs to look at if you're going to be serious about promoting youth in terms of being entrepreneurs. So that's important to get your paperwork out the way, because you're not going to be able to participate in any form of business without your CR39, COR39, without your BE certificates and all of that stuff. But over and above that, it's important to understand what is the additional legal requirements for your particular sector. So in ours is, for example, a generation license, EIAs. That's why I'm saying it filled up the entire room, because there's so many governmental consents you need. Even civil aviation authority approvals are required before you can build a power station. So, yeah. I don't know if
you'd like to add there, Benji, because there are quite a few photographers in the room, two here in front that I've just spotted as well. And as we know in your career and field of play, using drones as well becomes an area that they need to be cognizant of. So it does speak to many entrepreneurs, even influencers, looking at getting new exciting shots using drones. You know, that adds to the paperwork, but just understanding the fundamentals of compliance.
Sure, so I think, I mean, at a high level, we came at this from quite a different standpoint to Linda, in that our first 12 employees were all engineers. And we, unfortunately neglected paperwork early on. We were just focused on kind of building this amazing technology, and it really came back to bite us. I think what happened subsequently is the amount of effort and work that we had to spend on these meta parts of the business, rather than focusing on the problem itself, sort of started taking away from the business. And I mean, particularly with things like fundraising down the line, and I mean, we're sort of learning the hard way that not keeping that in order from day one was a problem. I mean, in terms of the specifics on the drone side of things, it's quite interesting. Like, I worked for Uber before this, and actually saw quite similar things happen in the regulatory space, where technology just advanced so quickly that regulation couldn't keep up. And as a result, regulation kind of has one of two options. Either you just open up and you let the technology kind of find its way, or you shut down everything. And we found it's been different in different markets. And in South Africa specifically, it's been super prohibitive, in that the regulation's been extremely slow, and it's been up to us to kind of find innovative ways of working around this and keeping up, because it really can kill an early stage business.
So do your research, understand the rules of the game, play within them, but where there might be flexibility, look to expand, and maybe there could be opportunities for further growth there.
On that, Gugus, I must say Benji raised a very important point about technology advancing ahead of regulation. So you may find, and one thing that wasn't mentioned here, especially for the innovators, is IP. You know, you need to really invest in your IP and make sure that you're registered. Whatever brilliant idea you have, if it's if it's worthy of a patent, you need to get ahead of it. But what we're finding in energy, for example, storage is a huge new innovative player, but government doesn't necessarily know how to they haven't regulated yet. So that's the next big thing in energy. And so we are 10 years ahead of where government is. So again, I think it's important for the regulators to sit with industry to be able to actually collaborate on regulation as well.
Very true. Yudhvira, I'd also like you to join in this conversation. I've kept you quiet for way too long. And actually building up on a critical point that Linda also mentioned, and Benji, feel free to jump in here. Dinesh, if you've got insight too. But on the number one, differentiator regarding your business and the competitive edge, how can we do that without getting into the heavy engineering, software, data analysis? Because sometimes when we think about this digital age and data analytics, we tend to get intimidated thinking that it's high-profile information that we're not privy to.
Yes. So I think the first point to make is a lot of the time when we hear these buzzwords, big data, analytics, data science, et cetera, there's the easiest way to try and think about it is that if you are focusing on your customer, you need information, inside data about them in order to run your business. So it's not this detached world where it's a completely separate thing that people need to worry about over and above running their business. In order to run your business successfully, you need data-driven insights. You need to collect information, to what Benji was saying. You need to understand the landscape around, is it regulation? Who are my competitors? How do I, let's say, benchmark myself against others?
And is that practical for people in various spheres here? Because we've got influencers and entrepreneurs who might have clothing lines. We've got individuals who might be artists who actually lay the status quo for creative industries as well. And maybe even individuals who might be interested in agriculture.
Yes, so here, data doesn't only mean ones and zeros. So it's not like a matrix code type of thing.
I think of those binary codes that we did back in school.
Yes, exactly. So it's not just a matrix of ones and zeros. It's about how do you collect information. Simply going out and asking your customer or going out to the public and polling the public on what do you think about a renewable energy solution? What do you think about being offered a drone capability that can help you do X, Y, and Z? Getting that insight from your customer is quite important. And especially if I look at the South African context, 5 years ago, call it 7 point something, rounded down to 7. 7 out of 10 startups fail in their first year. 5 years later, that number is still 7 point something. It's lower, but it's still 7. So in order for someone to succeed and actually be the 30% that survives and thrives, you need to make sure that you focus on running your business. You need to make sure that in order to do so, you understand the landscape around you by collecting information. You understand the future of where your business is going by not just trying to run around doing everything. You're an entrepreneur, focus on running your business. There is a marketing element, there is a sales element, etc., but they need to be enhancing what you're doing as opposed to you dividing. You can't be, let's call it a jack of all trades. You need to specialize in that and be able to get insights and tools to help you make those decisions, as opposed to trying to learn, you are a lawyer, and the best way was to then say, okay, I want to partner with someone else with the corresponding expertise.
Yeah, right. But unfortunately, sorry, I'll interject and say, when you are a startup, and I've been where, let's say, everyone else is, you are the secretary, you are the lawyer, you are the financial. I had to pick up my accounting textbook and remember ledgers. And, and I'm saying you're going to start off being, but I get what you're saying, that unfortunately, when you don't have the resources, you're going to start off being a jack of all trades.
Correct.
And then you have to, if you're going to grow,
there we go.
You're going to have a team around you. And for me, the business only started growing when I actually started allocating money for teams, because there's nothing more painful than paying someone's salary. Then you need to know how you're going to monetize. No, it's true. It's really true. You need to know where that salary is coming from at the end of the month. I've used a credit card to pay people's salaries. So we've all started from the bottom. So it's important to know that you don't just get there. There's a journey. But I think the biggest part for me has been You need to know how to monetize your business.
Correct.
Great that you have an idea, you're a fashion designer, but also don't go into the space where it's all popular. So for me, like the biggest people in fashion are Vlisco, who own the textiles that make the Ankara for Nigerian wear, and that's a Dutch company. What many people don't understand is that that's not an African company, that's a Dutch company. So even if you want to be a fashion designer, look at your competitive edge again. You're not, if everyone is making dresses, who's making the buttons? I want to know that guy.
Yes.
You know, even in a power plant, everyone wants to own the power plant. Who's making the nuts and bolts? Do you know that they're richer than us? Okay. So those are the things. Let's not go for the obvious, you know,
Exactly.
thing as well.
A critical point. A very pertinent point. Dinesh, did you want to add?
Yeah, so just talking to what Linda and Yudhvi were saying, I think understanding the competitive landscape is exceptionally important, and there's actually a lot of public data that's available, even as a startup. You often don't have to pay for it. If we think about established businesses, actually reveal a lot of information about what they're doing. So if you're going into a space that is competitive, or you find as competitive, you can actually look at what the existing sort of established businesses are doing. They reveal how their sales are doing. They reveal the issues they're facing. It's pointless, wanting to start up something into retail in SA, which is exceptionally competitive. And that's blatantly obvious. If you just read the newspapers, it will tell you that most retailers in SA are struggling. It's exceptionally competitive space. There's undercutting. If you look at food manufacturing, the food producers, it's a similar environment. So a lot is actually, you can glean a lot by just sort of, speaking to established players, and that information is pretty much free.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Learn from the bigger players in the markets that they're in, and of course try to adapt your models to actually find that competitive edge. There's something so critical that's also come up on this panel, and so often we talk about the power of collaboration, working together and exchanging ideas. But sometimes I feel as though my idea as Kuku is so fantastic that if I share it with Linda, she'll run off, steal my idea, and go and make millions off of it. And that's where the theme as well of IP protection also tends to come in. How do we manage that in a space where we all want to be innovators, we all want to be the players with the differentiating factor, but yet still tend to protect or conserve this idea that we have, so that the economic potential still lies with us? Or is that an unnecessary debate that we should actually be having? Linda, Benji, I know that was a key issue in your particular sector.
Yeah, I think in our case, like we're very much of the opinion that an idea is kind of an idea, and anyone can come up with an idea, and really the place to differentiate and to place yourself above the rest is in how you execute. And I think there's definitely value in IP protection, and especially as your business starts evolving and there's competitors and that kind of thing. But I think early on, like, it so often detracts from just adding value to a customer. And I mean, protecting your IP, you're solving your problem early on, you're not solving the customers. And people get so worried about it that, and become so protective that they don't actually execute and innovate. And I think there's 100% a balance, and it's super important, especially in like the tech space, to have some sort of protection. But I think just execution and trusting in your ability to out-execute sort of trumps that every time.
Makes a lot of sense. Another element I want to bring up very briefly before we have to wrap up is the money element, right? Because we all believe in order to grow your business, you need access to the right markets, but most importantly, capital to unlock the potential that you need, just regardless of whichever sphere that you're actually in. You've got some suggestions on this, but I guess from the entrepreneurs and many of you on the panel as well, there's no use having capital, not knowing where you're going to source it from, and also not having a plan as to where you're going to spend it.
Yes, there we go. And a lot of the time, it's, if I can say, that the symptom is the financing. The root needs to be having that document, the good business plan, the good idea that is starting to phase out in actually being realized. Because one of the hardest things is to actually go and capitalize on ideas that are not executed. So once you have been starting something and you are running it, then you start to get a track record. That track record needs to be then optimized to say, what can I do better, what can I do differently, in order to then say, wow, there's so much potential in this. I started off with whatever type of business. I've tried these different ways. I found the best way to go and do it. Here's my trajectory in the future. And that's such a key thing, to have that fundamental thing of take the idea and make it executable.
Exactly. Benji, if anyone Googles your company right away, they'll see articles about 59 billion rand, 29 million rand. These guys are in the money, but it's not on him. It's in a bank account and being used for specific things. Tell us about that, though. That experience of making sure that when capital is actually raised, you allocate it accordingly.
Yeah, I think it's been a super interesting journey for us. Early on, I mean, we self-funded the business, and I mean, by self-funded, we put in a couple $1,000 and sort of made it month to month again, paying salaries with credit cards. And quickly realized if we really wanted to grow this thing and make a difference, we needed some access to growth capital. And it was a huge learning curve for us. I think navigating the South African VC space.
VC meaning venture capital.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, we'd been exposed to sort of seed early stage funding overseas, and often you'd see companies get funded off the back of a great idea, a good market opportunity, and a good team. And in South Africa, we found that opportunity just didn't exist. And the capital was there, but the ability to deploy it in companies like ours just wasn't understood. And I think it was very much because the space locally is very traditional. It's people who've made money in asset management and private equity and banking industries, and they understand by nature sort of historical documents and discounted cash flows and all these things that like
technical terms, they can confuse you, and I guess that's where we end up calling you, Yudvir, to actually say we need assistance with financing from the bank, and usually that does come with a credit recognition. We are unfortunately under pressure for time, but 2 quick fire questions to both Danesh as well as Linda. What's the one business mistake entrepreneurs in the room should not make?
Don't get into a business you cannot monetize. Your time is your most valuable asset. So I find that, and it's something my husband taught me, he's like, oh, you're so great at giving people advice of doing this and running around. Yeah. But are you monetizing your time? And men tend to be better at this than women. I think we tend to be more giving of ourselves and of our time. But I've learned the best from men on how to monetize your value, your time, your ideas.
Fantastic. Dinesh?
It comes back to really understanding your competition. And in many of the businesses that we focused on and where we've actually lost money is because we didn't really understand the competitive landscape.
Secure the bag. But before you do that, make sure that you understand the research, play within the rules of the game, have a solid plan with regard to capital raising structures, and of course, once you raise that money or secure that loan, make sure that there's a clear and consolidated plan as to where that money will be allocated. It's been an absolute pleasure engaging with you. I hope many of the entrepreneurs have certainly walked away with some exciting tips, and many of these themes will be built on further throughout the day with additional panels on building brands and, of course, managing to secure capital. Linda, Danesh, Benji, and Yudvir, a great pleasure. Thank you so much. We'd like to hand over back to our MC, Lucy.
Thank you.